Thanks to Andrew and Alex for organizing this workshop once again. And just an apology to everyone here. Unlike the previous speakers, I don't speak with an Australian accent, so But our jumping off point is this idea that really the fundamental unit, the fundamental element of the brain is the neuron. And neurons are engineered to absorb information and to transmit information in the form of electrical impulses. So the way that neurons are interconnected with one another, the way that they are arranged, is going to influence how a signal propagates from one part of the brain to another. So what I'll show you today are a series of models, measures that represent competing theories about the nature of this communication and signaling process. The assumption that I'm working under is that the white matter architecture that you see on the left there provides the physical pathway for various elementary communication or signaling events to take place. And when you have the superposition of all of these communication events, you see the emergence of various phenomena such as statistical associations between time courses, things like functional connectivity and so on. One way to think about communication processes, in not just in the brain, but more generally in networks, is on this spectrum from, on the one hand, to the right, routing or shortest path communication. So this is an example where you have a source node and a target node, and a signal is transmitted via some optimal, for instance, shortest path from source to target. On the other end of the spectrum, we have something like diffusion. So this is a situation where a signal emanates from some source node, and it can be transmitted randomly to connected neighbors. Sometimes it's a single discrete signal that we think of. Sometimes it's a signal that is transmitted simultaneously to multiple neighbors. So this one, the way to think about this spectrum is as one of information. How much information would you need to impart to the various nodes in order to have them execute this communication strategy properly? How centralized would is the process? So let's just start with the simplest, which is shortest path routing. And I'll use those terms interchangeably. So if you were to take a guess as to what would be the best communication model for the brain, a really good starting point would be something like, well, you probably want to minimize the number of synapses that the signal has to travel through. Synaptic transmission is slow, and we want to be able to perceive rapidly changes in the environment. We want to be able to formulate responses to those changes. So you want to minimize how many synapses you have to go through. In addition, synaptic transmission is an electrochemical process. So it is susceptible to noise, to interference from other sources, etc. So if you want to preserve the signal, if you want to ensure fidelity, you again want to minimize the number of synapses you have to go through. And finally, the whole business of depolarizing the membrane, repolarizing the membrane, vesicular transport, all of this stuff requires resources. It requires energy, it requires material, and so on. So minimizing the number of synapses is also an economical solution. So if we want to formally talk about shortest path routing, it's important to distinguish paths from walks. A walk is any contiguous set of edges from a source to a target. So in this case, the source and the target node on the left-hand side are marked in red. And you can see two potential walks, one of length 5 and one of length 6. A path, and I'll use this interchangeably with shortest path, is the shortest such contiguous set of edges. So in this case, the path length between the two nodes is of length 4, and in this case, there is more than one way to go from source to target. So if we assume that shortest path communication is a good model, we can now derive a whole slew of informative measures and dependent measures and statistics both about the function of specific nodes and also the capacity for the network as a whole to process information. So one simple thing that you might want to calculate is the characteristic path length. Here you take every possible pair of nodes in the network and you calculate the path length between them. So the characteristic path length is then the mean of all of these shortest paths. If a network has a short characteristic path length, or if it has a high global efficiency, which is a related measure, then that network is well arranged, well organized to transmit information from one node to another on average. You can also ask for my specific favorite node, my region of interest, what proportion of these shortest paths actually go through the node. If a node sits on many shortest paths in the network, then it is optimally positioned to act as a way station or a bridge for signal traffic. It's well positioned to receive signals, to absorb signals, and also to potentially then integrate information. And finally, you can ask something like, what is the path length from my region of interest to the rest of the brain? If it's so-called closeness centrality. If the path length from the node to the rest of the brain is relatively short, if the node has high closeness centrality, then that node is well positioned to transmit signals to the rest of the brain and to influence the rest of the network. So I don't want to belabor this too much, but there have been many studies that have shown that these various measures of communication efficiency under shortest path routing tend to correlate with system fitness. So the example there on the MRI is a study in which the authors looked at the path length from the areas that are highlighted to the rest of the brain. And what they found was that the lower the path length to the rest of the brain, in other words, the greater the closeness centrality of these nodes, the higher the IQ of those participants. The example on the right is a recent study where they looked at how global efficiency changes, global efficiency of structural brain networks changes with normal neurodevelopment. And what they found was that essentially it increases. So as you start to acquire a greater capacity, sort of greater cognitive faculties, et cetera, you see a rearrangement of the network where now it's easier to transmit information from one part to the other. So what evidence do we have that the brain actually uses shortest path communication of some form? One line of evidence comes from this idea that the brain is a canonical example of a small world network. Small world networks have a path length that's close to the kind of the theoretical minimum of a random network, which you can see on the right-hand side there. So this idea then is that in the small world regime you have high clustering, but also low path lengths. It's very close to what you would get with a random network. So it appears as though this feature is somehow optimized in the generation of the network. A related kind of line of evidence comes from work on minimally rewired networks. So here, what the authors did was to take the brain of the brain network of a macaque and the kind of the central nervous system of C. elegans, and to create what are called minimally rewired networks. So they take all the nodes and they put them in their actual original physical locations, but they start adding connections between them so that they minimize the total wiring length or the wiring cost of the network. And the question is, could you create a set of networks that have overall a lower wiring cost than the real brain? And the answer is yeah. As you go from the top, as you go from the blue bars to the red bars, so to the minimally rewired network, you end up with networks that have much lower wiring cost. But the price of that, and that's what's shown on the bottom, is that the path length of these networks ends up increasing. So having short path lengths in a network is a costly feature, but it appears to be one that's readily incurred by the network. So the evidence then that we have for shortest path routing is basically one, biologically it would seem to make sense to try to minimize the number of synapses. Two, in general, many of these measures of shortest path communication tend to correlate with system fitness. And 3, there are various generative modeling studies that suggest that short path lengths are somehow desirable or promoted. So what I want to convince you then today is that shortest path routing cannot be the whole story. If you assume shortest path routing, you're making actually 2 assumptions. One is that the network elements, so the neurons or populations of neurons, that they know or are somehow aware of the global topology. They know where they are in the network, and they're able to actually calculate what the shortest path would be to the target location. This is a biologically somewhat implausible assumption. The other assumption is that if you use shortest path routing, you're going to end up using only a small proportion of the connections. And that's what I'm showing at the top here. On the left-hand side, you can see an original adjacency matrix from diffusion-weighted MRI. On the right-hand side, you see only the connections in that network that participate in at least one shortest path. And what you can see as you go from the original network to the shortest path skeleton, you go from about 24,000 connections to about 6,000 connections. So in other words, if you assume shortest path routing, you're assuming that only about a quarter of in this case, only about a quarter of the total infrastructure is being used, and the rest is just sort of vestigial. So it doesn't appear to be an economical use of the available resources. And a corollary of this is that if your communication mechanism relies on only a few elements, only a few connections, then it's going to be that much more susceptible to damage or compromise of some sort. So what are some other ways that we can think about that communication could take place? So there's a wide variety of mechanisms that are kind of intermediate between routing and diffusion. I'll just focus on one broad class, which is this idea of path ensembles. So here, we relax this assumption that we will only consider the shortest path between a source and a target, and we say, give me the top 2 paths between a source and a target. Give me the top 10, the top 100. And the idea is that you no longer want to consider one line of communication, one channel of communication between the source and the target. You want to now consider an entire kind of broadband set of channels between a source and a target. And if you do this, you can recalculate a lot of the statistics that we had before, sort of make inferences about the importance of individual connections, individual nodes, et cetera, et cetera. The nice thing about this is that it allows you to include more connections in the actual communication process. You allow more connections to contribute. And as a result, the communication process is by definition going to be more resilient to damage because it doesn't rely on only a small subset of connections. And what I'll show you now is just a very specific implementation of this kind of idea, the statistic of communicability, which is sort of used quite often. With communicability, we take a source and a target, and we say, okay, give me the weighted sum of all possible walks and paths between the 2 nodes. And the way that the weighting is done is you count the number of walks of length n. So for instance, the red path there has length 3, and there's only one of it. So you take the number of walks of length n and you divide it by n factorial. The reason for using this particular weighting scheme it's twofold. One is that it allows you to weigh the shorter walks more and to penalize the longer walks. And the other is that if this sum, some of you might recognize as a Taylor expansion. So the sum can be actually represented as the exponent of the adjacency matrix. So it has this very nice convenient property where we can calculate the statistic in one analytic step. So this is an example of how this can be used. This is a paper from Grayson and colleagues that came out a couple of years ago now. They were using designer receptors and designer drugs to deactivate the amygdala and the macaque, and looking at how resting state functional connectivity changes before and after amygdala deactivation. And what they showed was that the greater the structural communicability between the amygdala and a target node, so the greater the sum total of walks and paths between the amygdala and the target node, the greater the change in functional connectivity following the deactivation. So in other words, statistics like communicability tell us something about how two areas may functionally interact with one another through multiple pathways. Okay, so now all the way on the other extreme, and incidentally with communicability, we're dealing with a measure that's very, very close to the idea of diffusion. But when we talk about diffusion, probably the most common way that it's conceptualized is by analogy to a random walk. So in a random walk, you have a single agent, or quote-unquote walker, who starts in some source node and then randomly moves to one of the connected neighbors. In doing so, he can double back on his path. He may never ultimately reach the destination. The way that measures of diffusion efficiency are implemented, it usually starts by converting the adjacency matrix to a transition probability matrix. So on the left side, you have one row of the adjacency matrix. The random walker is sitting at the red node, and the red node has three neighbors with connection weights 1, 3, and 1. The probability of the random walker jumping to any one of those connected neighbors is proportional to their relative connection weight. So the total connection weight on that node is 5. So the probability of going to either the top node or the bottom node is 1/5, and the probability of going to the middle node is 3/5. And this again represents one row of the transition probability matrix. So you can go through every node in your network and work out what every one of these rows would look like. And what you have there is a Markov chain. When you have this, you can derive a whole set of statistics that are analogous to what we had with shortest path routing. You can ask, for instance, what is the expected time for a walker who starts out in node I to hit node J for the first time? What is the mean first passage time? You can ask, how many random walkers would I need to start in node I to ensure that at least one of them eventually hits node J to within some degree of probability? So the so-called resource efficiency. In other words, how strongly do I have to broadcast a signal from the source node in order to ensure successful transmission at the target node? You can also ask, if I was to start simultaneously two random walkers in node I and node J, so for instance you have simultaneous transduction of a visual stimulus and an auditory stimulus, what is the expected time at which they will meet? What is the coalescence time? And so with these sorts of statistics now, unlike with shortest path routing, we're in the realm of expected values, probabilities, bounds, and so on. But the idea is very similar. And the nice thing about these sorts of methods is that they're infinitely extensible. So you can introduce biases into how the random walkers move, and we'll touch upon this idea when we get to navigation. You can impart memory to the random walkers so that they know what was the previous node that they were at, or the previous two nodes, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've created this distinction between shortest path routing and diffusion, but it's important to keep in mind that there's a difference between shortest path routing and shortest paths themselves as an actual feature of the network. The network, even if there is no shortest path routing, the network still has short paths. So you might ask, how easy would it be for a random walker or for a diffusion-like process to find shortest paths just by chance? And that's where statistics like search information and path transitivity come in. So what you can see in the segments 3 and 4 are two paths from a source node to a target node. They have the same path length 3. In one of them, it's a straight shot from source to target, so the random walker could easily find his way from source to target. In segment 4, the path goes through a series of highly connected nodes. So the chances of the random walker getting lost along the way are greater. So the measure of search information is a measure of how much information would you have to impart to a random walker in order to ensure that he still gets to the target. And the way that it's implemented, it's a function of the degrees of the nodes along the way. In biological terms, if you have a signal that has to go through a series of highly connected neurons or neuronal populations, there is greater chance for that signal to be corrupted along the way because there are lots of signals from elsewhere in the network passing through that node as well. With path transitivity, which is shown in segment 5, we're looking at how many transitive closures there are along the shortest path, so how many closed triangles there are. The greater the number of closed triangles, the greater the potential for a random walker, even if he were to leave the shortest path, to eventually return. Or in biological terms, the greater the probability that the signal will be preserved along the way or potentially even amplified. So what the authors did here was to take structural connectivity network from diffusion MRI and to calculate the search information of path transitivity between all possible pairs of nodes in the network. That's what's shown in the upper triangles of the matrices. And in the lower triangles, they're showing the resting state functional connectivity between those pairs of nodes. And what you find is that the greater the search information between a pair of nodes, the greater the potential for the signal to get corrupted or compromised along the way, the lower the functional connectivity between them. That's what's in the scatter plot. Conversely, when you look at path transitivity, the greater the path transitivity between two nodes, the greater the potential for the signal to get preserved along the way, the greater the functional connectivity between them. So what this shows us then, you don't have to necessarily assume shortest path routing in order to still take advantage of the shortest paths in the network. So the next question, this is actually from the same group, is, well, how do diffusion efficiency and routing efficiency compare with one another? So what they did was to grow a series of synthetic networks, and they grew them to optimize either routing efficiency or diffusion efficiency. Here, diffusion efficiency is operationalized with mean first passage times and routing efficiency with path length. When you do that, you end up getting what's called a morphospace that's shown in the figure on the left. So it's a space of all possible network configurations. The morphospace is bounded by a series of fronts or Pareto fronts, which are kind of the frontiers of what's possible in this space, and they represent distinct types of network configurations. So what you can see is in front 1, that's at the top, you see a series of networks that have very prominent community structure or modules. So they have clusters of nodes that are densely interconnected with one another but have relatively few connections with the rest of the network. And in these types of configurations, shortest path routing or routing efficiency is greater than diffusion efficiency. And the reason is that if you have densely interconnected modules, a random walker will effectively get trapped. He'll just bounce around between nodes that are all in the same modules, and he has relatively few chances to escape and to go to another module. And incidentally, this is actually one of the ways that communities can be detected. On the bottom, on front 3, what you see are essentially small world networks with a connective core. So for these kinds of configurations, diffusion efficiency is not disadvantaged. A random walker could start out anywhere in the periphery of these networks, and just by chance, he could hit upon one of these nodes as part of the connective core. In doing so, he now has access to virtually any other corner of the network. So this is, I think, really important to keep in mind because it tells us that the efficiency of a communication mechanism is tied to the features present in the network. And so the next question is, well, we know that actually the two really canonical features of brain networks that keep coming up across multiple organisms and tracing technologies, imaging technologies, and so on, are a prominent non-trivial community structure and also this assortative kind of connective core. Which of these two mechanisms is better for brain networks? That's what's being shown on the right. The authors plotted various brain networks and other man-made naturally occurring networks in terms of their routing efficiency and diffusion efficiency. And what you can see is that most of the points lie along the identity line. In other words, they are about equally good at routing and diffusion. And this is perhaps by virtue of the fact that they have both communities and also this connective core. So why is all of this important? Why do we care about the actual communication mechanism? One important question to keep in mind is that how you conceive of the network elements, so the nodes and connections and their relationships with one another, is not going to depend just on the way that they're connected, but the way that they interact. And one simple example is how you think of what are the most important nodes in networks. You'll hear more about this in the next talk, but if you wanted to ask what is the most important node in the network, you have to think about how do the nodes actually relate to one another, how do they communicate with one another. If you think the communication takes place as kind of just a single shot where you just influence your neighbors, but then the signal doesn't go any further than that, then you might want to look at something like the degree centrality, in which case the node that's shown there on the right would be the most central node in the network. If, on the other hand, you assume that communication takes place by parallel transfer of discrete signals via shortest paths, then you might want to look at something like betweenness centrality, and the node with the highest betweenness is shown in the middle. And finally, if you think the communication takes place by signals being simultaneously transmitted to multiple neighbors and therefore sort of percolating through the network, then you might want to look at a measure like eigenvector centrality, where you're quantifying nodes' connectivity with other influential nodes, and that's shown on the left. So even a very simple exercise like what are the hubs of this network, what are the most important nodes, very much depends on how you think communication takes place. So what I want to kind of show in the last few minutes is some exciting new directions in this field. One is that, so I've talked about sort of routing and diffusion, but there's kind of a different axis here, and that is one of navigation. So navigation is a little bit like diffusion in the sense that it's a decentralized strategy for communicating, but unlike diffusion, you're not randomly choosing where to go next. Instead, you're using some other source of information or some other heuristic to pick where you send the signal next. And in this study, which actually just came out a few weeks ago, the author said, well, actually, the brain is a spatially embedded network. So there's this underlying metric space of spatial proximity. So what if when you send a signal, when you're choosing where to send a signal next to which of your neighbors, you send it to the neighbor who is physically closest to the ultimate desired target. So what the authors did then was to look at, and you can see on the left some examples of what these pathways could look like, but what they did was to look at the success ratio of this strategy. They asked, what is the probability of actually finding the shortest paths in the network by sort of blindly moving to the next physically closest node? And what you can see is that across a range of connection densities, and regardless of whether you use weighted networks, binary networks, whatever you like, you have success ratios that are very high, very close to 1. And there's a kind of a very significant difference from two different null models. So what this tells you then is by using this very simple heuristic, you can just sort of blindly recover lots and lots of the shortest paths in the network. You can take advantage of that infrastructure. So I think this is going to be kind of an exciting new frontier, and where you can certainly think of other ways of biasing communication and also choosing where to go next. Finally, the discussion so far, I kind of focused on this idea that what's being transmitted are electrical impulses and signals. But the brain and the white matter network is more generally a transport network. It supports propagation of various molecules, things like trophic factors in development or proteins and so on. So we can use these kinds of models to study more general questions related to transport. And one exciting new question is this idea that many neurodegenerative diseases have to do with normal proteins misfolding and then spreading transneuronally, spreading through white matter networks. So diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and so on all involve slightly different proteins. They all have slightly different points of origin, and ultimately the spreading patterns are different, but the mechanism could be very similar. And that's what you can see here is kind of one of the first examples of this at the systems level. At the top you see atrophy patterns in various neurodegenerative syndromes. And what you can see is that they look a lot like patterns of functional connectivity, and they look a lot like patterns of anatomical covariance. In other words, the atrophy pattern is very similar to patterns of connectivity. So what we and others have done is to use a lot of these kinds of models, for instance, biased random walks, to simulate how normal and misfolded proteins spread through white matter networks. And this is an example where we simulate the spread of alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's disease through white matter networks, and we try to predict what the pattern of cell death and atrophy would look like, and we reference this back to morphometric measures of atrophy. So if anybody is interested in this sort of work, Ying-Chu Zheng from our group will be presenting this 3:45 on Monday. And I'll just skip this last part. What I hope I've convinced you is that most network measures imply a very specific communication mechanism. You might be agnostic about how communication takes place in the brain, but your choice of whether you use path length-based measures or mean first passage times is critical, and it entails very, very different assumptions about how the brain works. Shortest paths are a critical feature of brain networks, certainly, but they are not the only possible communication mechanism. You can also conceive of communication broadly as either a diffusion-like process or a navigation-like process. And finally, this question of what is the way that communication takes place in the brain is really a complex multidimensional trade-off where you're taking into account questions like what is the efficiency of the process given the available topological features, what is the cost associated with this process, what is the resilience of this process to damage, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, a lot of these measures have application not just where we're talking about signals, but they have lots of application in medicine and engineering and so forth. So thank you for your attention, and please let me know if you have any questions.